Hello and welcome to the third lesson on competition 2.5, which is what is the economic impact of competition on producers and consumers? So by the end of this topic, you will be able to do the third learning outcome, which is to evaluate the economic impact of competition on producers and consumers. Now, note that word evaluate. This is a sign that you could get a 6-mark evaluation question on this particular topic. And a good tip is wherever you see the word evaluate in the specification, then you should be prepared for a 6-mark evaluation question on this topic. So this is quite a good bet for a 6-marker in the forthcoming exam. So let's take the impact on consumers first of all. Have a think about what the economic impact of competition is on consumers. Remember that it might depend on the different types of competition. Are we talking about price competition or non-price competition? So what are the effects of competition on consumers? Pause the video and we'll see if your answers match my answers. So the general assumption is that competition is good for consumers. And when you are trying to come up with a judgment on this topic in terms of evaluation, although there are benefits and costs of competition for both producers and consumers, economists tend to favor competition over a situation where there is no competition at all or a lack of competition. And we'll see that when we look at monopoly and oligopoly in our next lesson. But competition is generally favored by economists because competition leads to a fall in prices, as we saw in our previous lesson. Higher supply, lower prices. So lower prices is going to lead to greater real incomes for households. They're going to have more real purchasing power. Their money or their income is going to allow them to buy more goods and services for their money if the price of those goods and services goes down. And this increases what we call consumer welfare. The gap between the maximum that you'd be willing to pay for a product and the price of the product itself gets bigger the lower the price you actually pay. So better value for money, if you like, with lower prices. Another one is greater choice. Clearly, the more firms there are in the market, the more competition there is, the greater the choice of goods and services. And if firms are competing for branded products, then there might be more variety for consumers as well. So supermarkets, games, consoles, those are examples that we've explored already. There's quite a lot of variety in those markets, different types of games consoles, different types of supermarkets. Do you go for low price, low quality? Do you go for high price, high quality? There is choice, there is variety. We might also argue that greater competition will force firms to improve the quality of the product that they offer. So the free market tends to reward higher quality goods and services, and it tends to punish businesses that produce poor quality goods and services, because consumers then won't buy them anymore. So here we get something called consumer sovereignty in economics, which you have done with Ms. Reynolds. The consumer should get what the consumer wants. So all of this should lead to a rise in the standard of living for consumers, for households. There are some drawbacks, however, as far as competition is concerned. We've seen already that if we have non-price competition like advertising or higher quality, then that could lead to higher prices. We saw that in the previous lesson. So if competition, particularly non-price competition, is causing higher prices, that will actually have the reverse effect of what we have just explained. So higher prices means lower consumer welfare, less purchasing power for households. Also, if there is aggressive competition between businesses, there might be, as we've said before, a lot of advertising and promotions, and you might end up being persuaded to buy products that you don't really want. Now, we just mentioned consumer sovereignty, the consumer getting what the consumer wants. Now, if you buy something, if you're persuaded to buy something that actually when you get home, you realize that you didn't actually want or that you're not going to use, then that is not consumer sovereignty. That is actually reducing consumer welfare. That is leading to a misallocation of resources because you bought something that you didn't actually want. Finally, if businesses are competing on a price basis, that means that, as we saw in the first lesson, If businesses are competing and they continually cut their prices in a price war, then the price could end up being very close to or sometimes below the cost of production. And if the price is below the cost of production, business isn't making profit. So this could force businesses to try and cut their costs. And cutting costs can mean cutting corners, and cutting corners could mean that the quality of the product ends up being reduced, which of course is not good for consumers. So let's now look at the impact of competition on producers. And here we're going to do a slightly different approach, because rather than just using bullets, which we did for consumers, we're going to develop a chain of reasoning. And when you do your 6 markers, whether it's an analyze or evaluate 6 marker in the exam, it's important that you don't just write a list of points for a 6 marker. Anyway, you can't just write a list of points. You have to develop a chain of reasoning. So let's try and do that with this example of producers. So what is the economic impact of competition on producers? As we've just seen, it can lead to cost cutting, which can be a bad thing, as we saw earlier, but it could also lead to technological innovation. Businesses trying to invent new ways of doing things, or perhaps even new products in order to keep up with the technology. So this is going to lead to higher productivity of factors of production. The more capital per worker workers have to work with, the higher their productivity. So we see this with robots on a car assembly line, for example. That's going to raise the productivity of the workplace and the workers. Higher productivity is a key driver of growth in the economy. It's one of the biggest contributors to economic growth, which is a concept you'll come across next year if you haven't already. You may have covered GDP in geography, the overall size of the economy, the size of the output and the income generated by the economy. So more productivity leads to more growth in the economy. And more growth in the economy means greater demand for goods and services. So how's that going to impact on businesses? Well, clearly, if there's greater demand for goods and services, that's going to lead to greater revenues and profits for the business. So competition is good in the sense for producers, because we get a sort of virtuous circle of greater innovation leading to greater productivity, greater growth, greater demand for goods and services, greater revenue and profit, which then, of course, can be put back into technological innovation again. And, of course, more profit means you might get new investment. It might persuade, if you're making more profit, then a bank might be more persuaded to lend you money, and shareholders might be more persuaded to buy shares in your business. There are some bad points, some disadvantages of competition on producers as well. If you are a less efficient business, it could drive those less efficient businesses out of the market, businesses that are slow to adapt to changing technologies. So a good example from this year is Thomas Cook, is an example of a business that was slow to adapt to changing customer demands, people booking more holidays online, for example. And the failure of BHS, British Home Stores, in the consumer clothing market could be an example. And going back a few more years, the failure of Woolworths, which some of you might still have heard of, just before or during the credit crunch of 2008. These are all examples of businesses that were slow to adapt: BHS, Woolworths, and Thomas Cook. I'm sure there will be others during the coronavirus pandemic in 2020 as well. So here's the list of questions for this topic. They're not questions that I'm going to give you a numerical mark for this time. They are more tasks to do. Make sure you do them in the back of your books. Hand it all in as one document, remember, when the whole module is finished. And I will see you for the last lesson on competition next time.